1953. A two-room house at the edge of a hollow called Raven's Trace, up in the hill country of eastern Kentucky, where the road turned to mud every March and stayed that way until May. Cora May Spurlock lived there with her 3 children and a coal cook stove that ate through a quarter-ton of fuel every winter. She had buried her husband the previous October, shaft number 4 at the Laurel Fork operation, and by the time the company settled its account with her, she had $11.40 to her name and a winter coming in hard off the ridge. She kept a list on the inside of the cabinet door above the stovey, not a shopping list, a working list. What she had, how far it would go, and what she could make with it. That Tuesday morning in November, she had a half pound of dried pintos, 4 medium potatoes, a lard tin with maybe 3 tablespoons left in it, and half a sack of cornmeal. She had $2.70 for the week, for all 3 children and herself. She stood at that stove before the kids were up the farrel going on the shelf because it was still dark, and she looked at that list and she started cooking. And she never once called it poverty. She called it supper. If you are living alone right now and the grocery bill has gotten ugly and you are trying to figure out how a person on a fixed income is supposed to eat like a human being, friend, I need you to stay with me, because Cora May already answered that question. She answered it every single night in that 2-room house, and the answers are right here. She did not eat like someone who had given up. She ate like someone who knew things you and I have mostly forgotten. But here's the twist. The record now says that what Cora May cooked in that hollow for less than 30 cents a meal was more honest food than what they are selling you today in a box with a farmhouse painted on the front. She knew how to take a ham hock and a handful of dried beans and turn them into something that would hold a working body together for 12 hours. And sometime between 1955 and 1970, somebody spent a lot of money making sure you forgot that was even possible. My name is Wade Tolliver. I am 58 years old. My family has been on the Cumberland Plateau in eastern Kentucky since 1788, 6 generations at Tolliver Gap, and not one of them ever left. When my grandfather, Emmett Tolliver, passed, he left me a book. Black cover, worn at the corners, kept from 1931 to 1979. Front pages are all accounts. What a pound of fatback ran in 1937. What cornmeal cost by the bushel. What a family of 5 spent in a week. But the margins, friend, and the pages in the back, those belong to the women of the house. Emmett kept the numbers because he kept the books. But the recipes in those margins were put there because he wanted to know what each meal actually cost, and the women in his house were the ones who knew how to cook it. He made me promise that what was in those pages would not die with him. I have got 40 years of margins still to open. Today we are going back to the 1950s specifically, and we are pulling 25 suppers off the pages that almost nobody makes anymore. 2 of them I want to call out right now before we start the count. Number 18 costs less than $1.50 in today's grocery store, and it will feed 2 people with leftovers. And number 9 was put together by a widow over in a mining settlement in the Cumberland foothills who could not stand at the stove long enough to cook 2 separate dishes, so she figured out how to do the whole meal in one pot without losing a thing. Both of them are in the book. We are starting at 25 and working down to number 1, and I will tell you now that number 1 is not the thing you are expecting. It is the one that has the most writing on it, and it is the one almost nobody in this corner of the internet has talked about yet. I am going to mention it a couple more times before we get there, because I want you to stay all the way to the end. Number 25. Wilted lettuce salad with hot bacon dressing. This was a spring and early summer supper when the garden had lettuce coming in faster than you could eat it fresh, and there was always a strip or 2 of bacon left from breakfast. It was the meal that said, everything in this bowl cost me almost nothing because I grew it myself and the grease is already paid for. You took a big bowl of loose leaf lettuce, the kind that bolts quick if you don't cut it, and you tore it rough with your hands. 4 strips of bacon fried hard in a cast iron pan, pulled out, crumbled. Into that hot grease you put 2 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar and 1 tablespoon of sugar, and let it go for about 30 seconds until it smells sharp and sweet at the same time. You poured that straight over the lettuce while it was still popping, and it wilted the leaves down into something soft and glossy that sat warm in the bowl, salt and pepper. Maybe a sliced hard-boiled egg if you had one. That was supper. In 1953, a mess of garden lettuce cost you nothing if you grew it. The bacon grease was already in the pan. The whole bowl came in under 4 cents. Today you can do it for under $2 if you grow or buy loose leaf lettuce and you keep your bacon drippings, which Emmett's book says you always should. The extension services in this region still put out guidance on keeping drippings correctly. It disappeared from supper tables when bag salad showed up in the 1980s and the bottled dressing industry told you that making your own was too much trouble. The warm dressing hits that lettuce and for just a second, the whole kitchen smells like a Sunday breakfast. That is not a side dish. That is supper. Number 24. Cornmeal mush with sorghum. Not grits, neighbor. Mush is coarser ground, and it is cooked longer, and it is a different thing entirely. You brought 4 cups of water to a boil with a half teaspoon of salt. Then you took 1 cup of stone ground cornmeal and stirred it in slow, pulling the wooden spoon through the bottom of the pot in long strokes so it would not lump. You kept it on low heat and you kept stirring for 20 to 25 minutes until it was thick enough that a spoon stood up in it. You poured it into a buttered pan and let it set. What you had the next morning you sliced and fried in a little lard until it was golden at the edges. At supper you ate it hot from the pot with a pour of sorghum molasses over the top and maybe a pat of butter if there was any. The whole pot in 1953 cost under 10 cents. Today cornmeal runs about $1.20 for a pound. Sorghum syrup runs roughly $5 to $7 a jar, but it stretches over weeks, and the whole supper for 2 people still comes in under $1.50. It left the table when instant oatmeal and boxed grits took the hot breakfast market in the 60s and the grocery chains pushed hard on convenience. Nobody pushed mush because you could not put it in a packet. The sorghum on hot mush smells like a warm barn in October, and it is one of the most honest things you can put in front of somebody on a cold night. Number 23. Fried apple hand pies. Dried apples soaked overnight in water until they were soft, then simmered with sugar and a pinch of cinnamon into a thick jammy filling. Biscuit dough rolled thin, cut into circles with the rim of a glass, a spoon of filling in the middle, edges crimped closed with a fork, and fried in a shallow pan of lard over medium heat until they were brown on both sides. Not baked, fried. That is the difference. In 1953, dried apples came from the cellar or from the market for next to nothing. The whole batch of 8 pies ran maybe 12 cents. Today you can buy dried apples for about $3 to $4 a bag and make a full batch for under $3. They fell off the table when store-bought pie and then Little Debbie snack cakes were priced low enough on purpose to make home frying seem like it was not worth the trouble. Bite through that crust, and the warm apple filling smells like cinnamon and brown sugar, and it runs a little toward the edges. That is not a poor man's dessert. That is a craft that took practice. Number 22. Bean soup with cornbread crumbled in. This is going to sound plain, and it is not plain. You soaked a pound of dried navy beans overnight, drained them, covered them with water in the biggest pot you had, added a ham hock or a piece of salt pork, and simmered the whole thing for 2 to 3 hours until the beans were soft enough to crush between your fingers and the broth had gone thick and slightly milky. Salt, black pepper, sometimes a diced onion cooked down soft in the pot first. You ladled it into a bowl and you crumbled a whole square of fresh cornbread right into it so it soaked up the broth and turned the bowl into something between a soup and a porridge. 1 pound of dried navy beans in 1953 cost about 9 cents. The ham hock was often already in the house from a recent butchering and added almost no additional cost. Today a pound of navy beans runs about $1.70, a smoked ham hock or a piece of salt pork about $2, and the total pot feeds 4 to 6 people for under $4. It left the weekly menu when canned soup hit the 1 for a quarter price point in the late 50s, and the Department of Agriculture shifted its household guidance toward processed convenience foods during the Cold War era. When that cornbread absorbs the bean broth, it becomes something completely different than either thing on its own. Warm, thick, filling, in a way that sits with you for hours. Number 21. Cream dried beef on toast. The old soldiers called it something else, neighbor, and I will let you figure out what, but at the supper table in 1953, it was cream dried beef on toast, and it was a real meal. You melted 2 tablespoons of butter in a heavy pan, whisked in 2 tablespoons of flour, and let it cook for a minute until it smelled nutty. Then poured in 1½ cups of whole milk slowly, whisking the whole time until it thickened up smooth. You tore a 3-ounce package of dried beef into rough pieces and stirred it in, let it go another minute, and poured it over 2 thick slices of toasted white bread. Dried beef in 1953 ran about 22 cents for a small jar. The whole plate for one person cost under 30 cents. Today, a jar of dried beef is about $3 to $4, and the milk and butter bring the whole plate to roughly $2 for one person. It lost its place on the table, partly because dried beef got expensive relative to what it is, and partly because it got associated with military mess hall food, and people wanted to put that behind them. That sauce is rich and salty, and the toast underneath goes soft, where the cream soaks in and stays a little crisp at the edges where it does not. That is a 10-minute supper, and it is filling enough to be the whole meal. Now the first pattern break, friend. From number 20 down, we are not talking about making something good out of what you have left. We are talking about what went on the table when the week had been genuinely hard and the money was almost gone. These are the meals where the skill really shows. Pay attention. Number 20. Potato soup, no cream. Not potato chowder with cream and bacon bits and shredded cheese, the original. You cubed 4 medium potatoes and put them in a pot with 1 medium onion, sliced thin, and just enough water to cover, about 3 cups. You brought that to a boil and held it there until the potatoes were completely soft. Then you took a fork and mashed about half of them right in the pot, so the broth went thick and starchy without any flour. 2 tablespoons of butter stirred in at the end, salt and black pepper, and that was it. If there was a little milk, maybe half a cup went in at the end, and you let it come up to heat without boiling. 4 potatoes in 1953 cost under 5 cents. 1 onion was another cent or two. The entire pot cost roughly 10 cents and fed 4. Today, the same pot costs about $1.20. It went away from regular rotation when the canned soup aisle expanded in the late 50s, and a can of potato soup from a major brand was priced at about the same cost and required nothing but a can opener. What the can did not have was the starchy body that comes from mashing the potato right in the broth. That thick potato broth with the butter melted into it on a November night in a house that was not quite warm enough, that was not about surviving, that was supper. Number 19, salmon patties from a can. A 14-ounce can of pink salmon, drained, bones picked out or mashed in because the bones are soft and edible and they were usually left in, mixed with 2 tablespoons of cornmeal or crushed crackers, 1 egg, a few shakes of black pepper, sometimes a little diced onion, shaped into 4 patties and fried in a thin coat of grease in a cast iron pan 3 to 4 minutes per side until they were browned and firm on the outside. Served with whatever vegetable was in the house or over a plate of white rice. A can of pink salmon in 1953 ran about 25 to 30 cents. 4 patties for 2 people cost roughly 35 cents total. Today, a can of pink salmon costs about $2.20, and the whole batch of 4 patties runs under $3. They dropped off the table in the 70s when fresh fish became more available in inland grocery stores and canned fish took on a poverty association it never deserved. The outside of that patty is slightly crisp from the cornmeal, and the inside is soft and mild, and the whole thing holds together just well enough that it does not fall apart when you pick it up with a fork. That is a complete protein supper for 2 people for $3. Number 18. This is the one I mentioned at the start. Pinto beans and ham over cornbread. 1 pound of dried pinto beans soaked overnight, drained, put in a pot with a smoked ham hock and covered with fresh water by about 2 inches. brought to a boil, then held at a low simmer for 3 hours, adding water if needed, until the beans were completely creamy and the broth was dark brown and rich with the fat and smoke from the bone. Salt added only at the end because salt early makes the skins tough. Black pepper, red pepper flakes if you had 'em, ladled over a square of hot skillet cornbread that had been baked in a cast iron pan with a little lard in the bottom so the crust came out dark and crackled. Emmett's book has the cost for this meal in 1949 at 18 cents for a pot that fed 5 people. Today, a pound of dried pintos is about $1.40, a smoked ham hock is about $2, and the cornmeal for the bread is maybe 60 cents. The full pot feeds 4 to 6 people for under $4.50. That is under $1.25 a person. It left a weekly rotation in a lot of households in the 60s and 70s, not because it got expensive, but because dried beans came to be seen as something you ate only when you had no other choice. And that perception was helped along by the marketing of canned beans and packaged dinners that promised you the same thing in 12 minutes. You pull that ham bone out of the pot, and the meat falls off in soft strings. You spoon the beans and the dark broth over the cornbread, and the bottom of the cornbread softens while the crust edge stays firm. If you sit down at a table and eat that slowly, friend, you will understand exactly why Cora May Spurlock stood at that stove before her children were up. This is your first task for this week. Buy 1 pound of dried pinto beans. They are in every grocery store, and they cost almost nothing. Soak them overnight in a bowl of water. Cook them on Sunday. That is all I am asking. Number 17. Fried fatback with milk gravy. Thin slices of fatback, which is cured salt pork from the back of the hog, fried hard in a cast iron pan until they were rendered crisp and the grease was deep enough to work with. The meat pulled out, the drippings left in the pan. 2 tablespoons of flour whisked into the hot grease and cooked for a minute until it turned the color of light sand. Then 1½ cups of whole milk poured in slow and stirred constantly until the gravy thickened and went smooth. Salt and plenty of black pepper. The crisp fatback served alongside or crumbled into the gravy, and the whole thing poured over biscuits or boiled potatoes. A pound of fatback in 1953 ran about 12 cents. Today it is harder to find at regular grocery stores, but available at most southern and midwestern meat counters for about $2 to $3 a pound, and the whole meal for 2 people costs under $3. It went away largely because fat got demonized in the nutrition guidance of the 1980s, and the cut itself became unfashionable. The Department of Agriculture's dietary guidance shifted hard in that era toward leaner cuts, and the household use of lard and salt pork dropped sharply. That gravy has the color of old ivory, and it is thick enough to coat the back of a spoon, and it smells like a cast iron pan that has been seasoned for 30 years. Over a split biscuit on a cold morning or over boiled potatoes at supper, it is as filling a thing as you can make for the money. Number 16. Fried cornmeal mush cakes. Savory version. Leftover mush from the night before, sliced cold into half-inch rounds, dredged lightly in cornmeal, fried in a thin coat of lard until each side was golden and had a crust that cracked when you pressed it. Served with a fried egg on top if there was one, or with a spoonful of beans alongside, or just with a pour of sorghum. This was the meal that used what was already there and asked nothing new of the budget. Cost in 1953, essentially zero since the mush was already made. Today, the incremental cost above the mush you already cooked is under 50 cents. It disappeared from regular practice when leftover reheating habits changed, and when the microwave made it easier to heat something new than to fry something old. The crust on the fried mush shatters a little when you cut into it, and the inside is still soft and warm. With a fried egg on top, it is as good a plate of food as anything more complicated. Number 15. Water gravy, also called pour gravy or drippings gravy. This is the one that Emmett wrote about in the margins more than almost any other because he tracked the cost and it was a fraction of a cent per serving. Pan drippings from whatever meat had been cooked that week, or just straight bacon grease, reheated in the pan. A tablespoon of flour stirred into the hot fat. Then water, not milk, about 1.5 cups, whisked in gradually while the pan stayed on medium heat until the gravy thickened into a thin, smoky, dark brown sauce, salt and black pepper. And that was it. Poured over biscuits, over boiled potatoes, over plain white rice, or just soaked up with a thick slice of cornbread. The cost in 1953 was whatever the fat was worth, which in most houses was already a byproduct. Today, if you keep your drippings, which costs you nothing because you are using what you already made, the cost of this gravy is the flour and the water, under 10 cents. It left regular use when keeping drippings went out of fashion in the health-conscious 70s and 80s, and when gravy mixes and canned gravy made it seem like the scratch version was no longer necessary. Water gravy does not taste thin. The fat and the flour and the heat from the pan develop a depth that the liquid-only version does not have. It is darker and smokier and slightly thinner than milk gravy, and it is the right thing for certain plates. Now the second pattern break, neighbor. From number 14 down, we are into what the women in Emmett's book cooked when the larder was empty by Wednesday and payday was not until Friday. This is not frugal cooking, this is the edge of the pantry. Every one of these has 2 or 3 ingredients. Every one of them is still a real meal. Number 14, fried apple rings with side pork. Fresh apples, cored and sliced into rings about a 1/2 inch thick with the skin left on. Fried in a cast iron pan in a little lard or bacon grease until they were soft in the middle and caramelized on both sides, deep gold with brown edges. Served alongside thin slices of side pork, which is similar to bacon but uncured and with more fat, fried in the same pan first, so the apple rings took on the flavor from the drippings. Sweet and fatty and salty on the same plate. Apples in the 50s were often grown or traded, nearly free. Side pork ran about 15 cents a pound. The whole plate for 2 cost under 20 cents. Today, side pork is about $3 to $4 a pound, and 2 apples cost about 70 cents, total plate under $3 for 2 people. It disappeared from the supper table when apples became primarily a snack fruit rather than a cooking ingredient, and when side pork lost its grocery store shelf space to bacon. Those caramelized apple rings smell like the inside of a warm kitchen in November, and the contrast with the salty pork on the same fork is the whole point of the dish. Number 13, hoe cakes with leftover vegetable pot liquor. Hoe cakes are small cornmeal cakes, not biscuits, not cornbread exactly, cooked in a greased cast iron pan. 1 cup of cornmeal, 1/2 teaspoon of salt, enough boiling water mixed in to make a thick batter, formed into rounds about the size of your palm, fried in a little lard until each side was firm and lightly browned. Served with a ladle of the pot liquor, which is the liquid left in the pot after cooking any long-simmered green vegetable, turnip greens, collards, mustard greens, with a piece of pork. The pot liquor is deeply savory and dark, and you dip the hoe cake into it or poured it over the top. The whole plate in 1953 ran under 8 cents. Today, cornmeal is about $1.20 a pound, and the pot liquor is a byproduct of a dish you are already making, so the incremental cost is nearly nothing. This combination left the table when the habit of saving pot liquor stopped, which happened as home cooking became faster and more ingredient forward, and the liquid that the greens cooked in started getting poured down the sink. The hoe cake soaks up that pot liquor and goes from something dry and plain to something that tastes like the whole pot of greens it came from, concentrated and rich. This is one of those combinations where the sum is absolutely not equal to its parts. Number 12, fried bologna. This is on the list because in the 1950s, bologna was a serious supper meat, not a lunch meat for children. You took a thick slice, a 1/4 inch or more, scored it around the edge with a knife in 4 places so it would not buckle, and laid it in a hot, dry cast iron pan. It blistered and curled at the edges and turned brown where it touched the iron and went slightly crisp on both sides. Served on a plate with whatever was alongside, fried potatoes, sliced tomatoes in summer, beans, or just with white bread and mustard. A pound of bologna in 1953 cost about 30 cents. Today it runs about $2 to $3 a pound. A thick slice for supper costs roughly 50 cents per person. It left the supper rotation when it got firmly repositioned as a sandwich meat for school lunches in the 60s and 70s, and the thicker cooking cut was no longer how it was sold or thought of. When bologna blisters in a hot, dry pan, it gets a crust on the face of it, and the edge crisps up, and it smells like a hot diner grill. That is not a child's lunch. That is a skillet supper. Number 11. Tomato gravy over biscuits. This was a summer harvest supper and a way to use tomatoes that had gone very ripe. 2 tablespoons of bacon grease in a pan, 2 tablespoons of flour cooked in it for a minute, then 2 cups of crushed fresh or stewed tomatoes poured in and stirred while the heat worked the flour into the tomato, and the whole thing thickened into a dark red gravy with a sharp, sweet, slightly acidic smell. Salt, black pepper, a pinch of sugar if the tomatoes were too acid, poured over split biscuits. Tomatoes from the garden in 1953 were essentially free. The flour and the grease were already in the house. Total cost under 5 cents. Today, if you use a 14-ounce can of crushed tomatoes at about $1, the gravy for 2 runs under $2. It faded when biscuits moved to breakfast only, and the association of gravy as a savory morning or noon thing broke apart from the supper table. That tomato gravy over a biscuit smells like August in a kitchen with the window open and a garden just outside the screen door. Number 10. Dried bean burgers, also called poor man's hamburgers. Cooked pinto or navy beans, mashed until mostly smooth with the back of a fork, not in a machine, just by hand. Mixed with 1 egg, a few tablespoons of cornmeal or cracker crumbs to bind them, salt, black pepper, and a little diced onion, cooked soft first in a pan. Formed into patties and fried in a little grease until they had a dark crust on both sides and held their shape. Served on a plate or on a slice of white bread with mustard or whatever was in the house. Emmett's book puts the cost in 1952 at about 4 cents per patty, using beans already cooked in the pot. Today, the marginal cost above a pot of beans you have already made is under 50 cents per patty. These left the table when ground beef dropped in price relative to dried beans in the late 50s due to federal commodity price supports and the expansion of industrial beef processing, and the bean patty got filed away as something you ate only when you could not afford meat, which it never was. The cornmeal crust on those patties crisps up in the pan, and the inside is soft and savory, and the cooked onion sweetens the whole thing. They are not trying to be a hamburger. They are their own thing. Number 9. This is the widow's one pot, the one I told you about early on. Her name was Edna Fay Combs, and she lived alone in a coal camp settlement in the hills above a wide creek valley in the southeastern part of the state, and her knees had given out enough that standing at the stove for more than about 20 minutes at a stretch was a cost she thought about carefully. She needed a meal that she could put together before the pain came, walk away from, and come back to when it was done. What she worked out was this. Into a heavy-lidded pot, she put 1 cup of dried split peas, rinsed, 2 medium potatoes cubed small, so they would cook through, 1 small onion, rough chopped, a piece of salt pork, about the size of 2 fingers, scored, enough water to cover everything by 2 inches, about 5 cups, lid on, low flame. She walked away for 2 hours. What came back to was a thick, fully cooked supper where the split peas had dissolved into the broth and thickened it into something almost creamy. The potatoes were completely soft, and the salt pork had given everything a deep smoked undertone. She salted it at the end and crumbled a piece of cornbread into it, and that was the whole meal. 1 cup of dried split peas in 1953 cost about 7 cents. The salt pork, the potatoes, the onion, all together under 20 cents. Today, split peas run about $1.80 a pound, and the full pot costs under $3.50 and feeds 2 people generously or 1 person twice. He left the regular rotation when convenient soups replaced the dried legume habit, and when the slower pace of cooking that it required stopped fitting how people used their kitchens. The split peas go to silk in that pot, and you cannot tell where the pea ends and the broth begins. It is the warmest, most complete thing a person sitting alone can make for almost no money and almost no effort, and it was invented by a woman who was solving a real problem with what she had. Your second task this week: a bag of dried split peas. They are $1 or $2 at any grocery store. Salt pork or a piece of smoked ham hock. 2 potatoes, 1 onion. Lid on the pot. Walk away. Come back in 2 hours. Sit down at the table, not the couch. Set a place. Eat it slow. Number 8. Crackling cornbread. When you rendered lard at home, which most households did through the 1950s, you were left with cracklings, the small firm pieces of pork skin and meat that stayed behind after the fat was poured off. They were salty and slightly chewy and full of the flavor of whatever the hog had been. You stirred a half cup of them into a standard skillet cornbread batter, 1 cup cornmeal, 1 egg, 3/4 cup buttermilk, a tablespoon of lard melted into a cast iron pan before the batter went in, and you baked it at a hot oven till the top cracked and turned deep gold and the house smelled like a smokehouse and a bakery at the same time. Cracklings in 1953 came from the rendering process and cost almost nothing because they were a byproduct. Today you can buy them packaged at most southern grocery stores for about $2 to $3, and the whole skillet of crackling cornbread runs under $3 total. This went away when home lard rendering stopped, which happened gradually through the 60s as hydrogenated shortening and then vegetable oil replaced lard in most household kitchens, pushed by a long marketing campaign that positioned lard as unhealthy and shelf-stable vegetable shortening as modern. That crackling cornbread has a crust on the bottom that you pry off the pan in one piece and it shatters. The cracklings inside are soft from the baking and they give you a hit of salt and pork fat in every third bite. That cornbread does not need anything on it. Number 7, leftover biscuit and egg scramble. Day-old biscuits, crumbled roughly by hand into chunks about the size of a walnut, 3 eggs beaten in a bowl with a splash of water and salt and black pepper, 2 tablespoons of bacon grease or butter heated in a cast iron pan until it shimmered. The biscuit pieces in first, pressed flat a little so they browned on the cut sides, then the egg poured over and scrambled slow with a wooden spoon until it just set, leaving the biscuit pieces partly crisp and partly soft inside the egg. That was supper on a night when there was nothing new in the house. Cost in 1953. Essentially free, since the biscuits were already made and the eggs were from the yard. Today, 2 or 3 eggs run about 50 cents and the leftover biscuits are already paid for, total plate under $1. It left the table when the habit of making biscuits from scratch every morning disappeared and there were no longer leftover biscuits to use. The browned edges of the biscuit pieces stay a little crunchy in the egg, and the inside of the biscuit chunk goes soft and custardy. It is a different thing than scrambled eggs alone. It is a meal that uses up what is there and makes it better than it would have been fresh. Number 6, hominy with butter and salt. This is going on the list because hominy is one of the most unfairly forgotten staple foods in the American South and Midwest, and it deserves to be talked about plainly. Hominy is dried corn that has been processed in an alkaline solution, traditionally wood ash lye water, which changes the nutritional profile of the corn and makes certain nutrients far more available than they are in untreated corn. The Department of Agriculture and historians of nutrition have written at length about how the populations that ate nixtamalized corn, which is what hominy is, were substantially better nourished than those who ate plain ground cornmeal as a primary staple. In the 1950s, canned hominy was already available and common. You opened the can, drained it, put it in a pan with a tablespoon of butter, salted it, and heated it through until the edges of the kernels started to go slightly golden. That was it. It ate soft and chewy and starchy, somewhere between a potato and a dumpling, and the butter and salt turned it into something you could eat a full plate of. A can of hominy in 1953 cost about 10 cents. Today, canned hominy runs about $1 to $1.50 and is still widely available. This is one of the few items on this list that did not disappear from grocery stores, but it did disappear from the regular supper table because it lost its place in the household mental list of what constitutes a real side dish. Hominy and butter with salt and a grind of black pepper smells like toasted corn and warm fat. If you have never had it, neighbor, it is one of the easiest things to get back on your table tonight for under $2. Now, the third and last pattern break, and this is where we are going to the very bottom of the account book. The next 5, down to number 1, are what Emmett wrote about in the margins with the most respect. Not the most expensive meals, the most considered ones. The ones where a woman with almost nothing made something that still fed people properly. Number 5, salt pork and milk gravy over potatoes. Salt pork sliced thin and fried in a cast iron pan until it was rendered, and the lean parts had gone dark at the edges. Pulled out of the pan, the fat left behind, about 2 tablespoons. 2 tablespoons of flour cooked in that fat until it smelled like toasted grain. Then 1½ cups of whole milk, or in thin years water and a splash of milk, whisked in and brought up to a thick, pale gravy with the salt and smoke of the pork built into every spoonful, poured over boiled potatoes halved in the pot. The fried salt pork served alongside or crumbled back into the gravy. Emmett wrote the cost for this in 1938 as 11 cents for 2 adults and 2 children. Today, salt pork runs about $2 and the potatoes and milk bring the total to about $3 for the same number of people. It left the table when salt pork became unfashionable as a cooking fat and primary protein in the late 60s, and the cut became harder to find at the front of the meat case. The gravy is thicker and more savory than milk gravy made with butter because the pork fat has more character than butter in that context. Over hot-boiled potato halves with the skin on a night when the temperature has dropped, that is the whole meal, and it is enough. Number 4, dried corn soup, not fresh corn. Dried corn, which most households had because drying corn was how you preserved it, soaked overnight in cold water until it softened and swelled back toward its original shape, then simmered in a pot with water, or with the water it soaked in, a piece of smoked pork of any kind, and a diced onion, for 1½ to 2 hours until the corn was tender and the broth had gone a deep yellow gold with the starch of the corn leaching out into it. Salt and black pepper. If there were dried beans in the house, a ½ cup went in too. That was the soup. Dried corn in 1953 in rural households was often home-dried and nearly free. A small piece of smoked pork added maybe 10 cents. Today, dried corn is available from specialty grain suppliers and some rural grocers for about $2 to $3 a pound, and the full pot runs about $3 to $4 for 4 servings. It left households when fresh and canned corn became the default form, and the practice of drying corn at home stopped almost entirely. That soup has a color and a depth that fresh corn soup does not have because the drying concentrates what is in the corn. The broth is thick and faintly sweet, and the dried corn itself has a chew to it that reminds you the corn was once something that had to be worked. Number 3, egg drop soup, Appalachian version. This is not the Chinese restaurant version, though the method is related. Into about 3 cups of a simple broth, water with a piece of salt, pork, or a pork bone, simmered for an hour, and then the meat removed. You stirred slowly with a wooden spoon to create a gentle current. 2 eggs beaten in a cup until they were smooth. You poured the egg slowly into the moving broth in a thin stream, stirring constantly, and the egg set into thin, delicate ribbons throughout the pot. Salt and pepper, sometimes a little cornmeal stirred in beforehand to give the broth more body. That was supper. 2 eggs in 1953 from a backyard flock cost nothing. From a neighbor they traded for something. Total cost of the meal under 5 cents. Today, 2 eggs cost about 50 cents. And if you have a pork bone from something else you have already cooked, the soup runs under $1.50 for 2 bowls. It left the table when the idea of broth-based suppers gave way to the expectation of a more substantial plate, and when the labor of making a bone broth from scratch stopped feeling worth it relative to opening a can. Those egg ribbons in the hot pork broth are light and savory, and the bowl is not heavy. It is the right meal when someone in the house is not feeling well, or when the week has been hard and you need something warm that does not ask a lot of the stomach. It also costs almost nothing, and it is done in 15 minutes. Number 2, fried sweet potato with sorghum and butter. Sweet potatoes sliced into rounds a half-inch thick, skin left on, fried in a cast iron pan in a little lard over medium heat, lid on for the first few minutes to steam the inside through, then lid off and heat up to finish and caramelize the cut face until it was dark gold and the sugar in the sweet potato had pulled to the surface and started to go sticky at the edges, pulled onto the plate. A tablespoon of butter and a pour of sorghum molasses over the top while they were still hot, so everything melted together into a dark, sweet, almost savory pool on the plate. One sweet potato in 1953 cost about 2 to 3 cents. Today, a large sweet potato runs about $1. Sorghum is a few cents per tablespoon from the jar, and the whole plate for one person costs under $1.50. This left the supper table when sweet potatoes became a holiday side dish, and their year-round use as a staple supper ingredient was gradually replaced by other starchy sides. The sorghum pairing specifically disappeared as sorghum production in the eastern states declined sharply through the 1960s and 70s, and the syrup became a specialty item rather than a household staple. The caramelized face of that sweet potato is almost sticky, and the butter and sorghum melt into each other and pool in the center of the plate. It smells like November. It is sweet enough to satisfy that part of the appetite and filling enough to be a meal when there is cornbread alongside. There is nothing sad about this plate. And now, number 1. I have mentioned it twice. Here it is. Number 1. The Depression skillet. The full meal in one cast iron pan. I said at the start that the number 1 would not be the thing you were expecting, and it is not, because this is not really a single recipe. It is a technique, and it is the most important thing in the book. And it is the thing that Emmett wrote about most carefully because he watched it being done for 40 years and he thought it was the most elegant solution in the whole account. Here is the technique. You take whatever you have. In lean times, it might be 2 potatoes, half an onion, 3 strips of bacon, or a piece of salt pork, and 2 eggs. In better times, there might be leftover beans, a piece of cornbread, a cup of yesterday's greens. The rule is the same regardless. You start with the fat, whatever fat you have, into the pan first on medium heat, then the things that take longest. Diced potato, diced salt pork, sliced onion. They go in and they get moved every couple of minutes, but not constantly, because you want them to develop color on one side before you move them. When the potato is cooked through and the onion has gone translucent and a little brown at the edges, everything else that needs heat goes in. Leftover beans get stirred through. Leftover cornbread gets crumbled in for the last few minutes so it crisps in the drippings. If there are eggs, they go in last, cracked right onto the top of everything and left to set with the lid on for 2 minutes, or scrambled through if you prefer. You eat it from the pan or you plate it once and you sit down. Emmett's book has this technique under a heading he wrote in his own hand in 1941. He wrote, "Whatever is left, do not waste it. Combine it with heat and fat and patience, and it is a meal." He tracked the cost for 3 variations over 20 years of the book. Every single one came in under 25 cents for 2 people in its decade. Today, the same skillet using potatoes, an onion, a few strips of bacon, and 2 eggs runs about $2.50 for 2 people. There is no version of this that costs more than $4 for 2, regardless of what you put in it. This technique did not disappear the way a specific recipe disappears. What disappeared was the habit of mind behind it, the habit that says, there is always a meal here if you know how to look at what is in the house. That habit is what Emmett was tracking. That habit is what the women in his house practiced every single day. And that habit is what the packaged food industry spent 50 years training us out of, because it is the one habit that does not require you to buy anything. You do not need a recipe for this. You need a cast iron pan, some fat, and the patience to let things sit in the heat long enough to become something. That is the one. And that is the whole list. Here is my challenge, friend. Make one of these this week. Just one. The split pea pot, the pinto beans, the skillet, whichever one sounds like, it belongs in your kitchen. And when it is done, sit down at the table, not the couch. Set a place, use a real plate, eat it slow, because these meals were never about being cheap. They were about staying alive and staying human when the world made it easy to do neither. Cora May Spurlock knew that. Edna Faye Combs knew that. Emmett knew it too. And he wrote it down in a book with a black cover because he wanted someone to still know it after him. Your grandmother cooked every one of these. Somebody just didn't get the chance to hand them down to you. Now they're yours again. Tell me which one you are going to make. I want to know if the Depression skillet gets more love than the split pea pot. And if your family still makes any of these, tell me where you are from. I read every single one. The dish with the most comments is the one I walk through completely in the next video. Every step, every cost, every piece of history. Next time we are pulling out the ingredient that cost 2 cents a pound and kept an entire mountain settlement fed through the winter of 1936 and the decade when the commodity markets made sure it vanished from your grocery shelf so quietly that most people do not even remember what it was called. Keep what they knew. It'll keep